Hi, it's Rob from the Brush and Boltgun. Today I'm going to be doing part 2 of the tutorial on how to paint Illuminor Szeras. So I've placed to cut the video. We're going to add white to the previous mix, which was Citadel Rakarth Flesh and White. And this is just to do one final highlight on his cloak. Now you may or may not want to do this layer as an extra highlight. Just depends on how bright you want that final layer to be on him. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Khorne Red. We're going to start reapplying the colour to the purity seals and also to the trim of his robes. As always, you want to leave some of that shade in the recesses. Make sure that you're mainly highlighting the top areas that will be getting the most light. Once you've finished those sections, we can move on to the next colour. Now we're going to be using a little bit of Citadel Red. Red. I'm going to be using this to highlight the Khorne Red that you've just reapplied to his sleeves and also the purity seals. You want to have a think about where the light is going to catch it and try and mainly illuminate and highlight those parts. Like so. Now I'm going to do one final highlight on those sections. We're going to be using Citadel Pink Horror. Just going to do some nice thin edge highlights. And also on the purity seals, you're going to be highlighting those by putting almost either thin lines or dots on the little sections which will be catching the most light, just to bring those details out. Like so. Next up, we're going to be using a little bit of Vallejo White. We're going to be putting his eyes in place. So as always, I'm using a really thin brush. I'm using the Army Painter Wargamer character brush. And I'm dragging the paint from his nose towards the outside of his face to get the eye. This will give you the kind of shape of the eye, it being long with the eyelids rather than being a round dot if you do it from the front. I'm going to start working on the liquids now, starting with Citadel Emperor's Children. And what I'm trying to do here is pick out the bits which would be kind of catching the light, using a similar technique to how I did the video on how to paint liquid drips, which I'll link up here. Because of the way the liquidy stuff here is flowing upwards, it does make it quite interesting, a bit tricky to find the right areas that you're going to highlight. But provided you try and do the same kind of highlights on similar style bits all the way up, it will look fine once you've finished. Now we're going to be using some Citadel Pink Horror. And we're going to work the colour back onto the drippy bits on the next section. So again, you're trying to add this colour back to it. Give it some highlights where you think they will be going. Now just a little bit of Mephiston Red from Citadel here, and we're going to do the final piece at the top before we come back and start highlighting all of these sections in a moment. So as with the other parts, you want to be thinking about the light catching it and the way the liquid would have the light and dark areas. I'll link up the video to the liquid drips below. And also you'll have the link above for the liquid drips that will pop up intermittently while we're doing this bit, I think. Now I'm going to add a little bit of white to the Mephiston Red, and we're just going to start highlighting these drips. Now this is where the technique from the liquid drips really comes into its own. We're highlighting each of those drips like we would have done if it was just an individual drip, and then we're trying to tie that together with similar kind of effects on the way down. Now you can see here I'm using the highlight colour that I'm painting on to merge the red and the pink horror together, so you get that a little bit blended. Now it's just a little snotty cat in the background there. So that's how we're looking so far with it. Now we're going to use a little bit more white and mix that in with the previous mix, and again we're going to highlight the liquid in the same way as the liquid drips video. Now I am keeping mentioning this because it's worthwhile having a watch of that video so you can get the idea of the kind of principles and the technique that I'm using to paint this long flowing bit of liquid. What I'm trying to do is all these little nodules and bits poking out on the drips at the end, trying to highlight each of those in exactly the same way. So we're going to add white to the previous mix again. And the cat's just sneezed all over my headphones there, which is delightful. Just one of the final highlights on this bit. You want to be doing a really small area just to bring those little ridges and drips and stuff out. And then we're going to finish it off by using a little bit of pure Vallejo White. And here we're going to be doing like you would do on a singular drip or a glass bottle or a vial or anything like that. You're going to be doing some thin lines and dots on the darkest sections of the fluid, and also you're going to be doing little highlights on the areas that you've highlighted with the pinks coming up from the red, like little dots of colour on there. So now we're going to start on the middle bit. We're going to use a little bit of Citadel pink horror mixed with a little bit of Vallejo White, and then we are going to start highlighting this in exactly the same way that we did the Mephiston Red section above. I've added a little bit of white to the pink horror, and we're now highlighting this section in exactly the same way as we did with the previous part, where we had the Mephiston Red coming up and into the drips. We're doing exactly the same thing here, but with the pink horror section. So you're trying to paint each of those drips and each of those ripples in the same way that you would paint an individual liquid drip, so that you have that contrast between the highlights on the ridges and the top surfaces or bottom surfaces, depending on how you're doing the drip, and also the dark sections on the underside and the body of the fluid. So now we're going to use a final layer of just pure white with this. You don't need too many layers on these pink parts because they're light coloured anyway. So we're just going to add some little spots and little lines of light reflection on the liquid. Apologies for this being slightly off camera because it's zoomed in. It does make it a little bit awkward to keep that in shot. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Emperor's Children and a little bit of Vallejo White. We're now going to start highlighting this section at the very bottom, exactly the same way as we did the previous two sections. If you see the black thumbnail there, that was from a can of Army Painter spray that the taking the cap off, or the lid off, seemed to rip the actual spray nozzle from the top of the can, which is the first time I've had that happen. And then trying to put that little nozzle back onto the can, it just sprayed black paint everywhere, so I had that all over my hands and my face and the patio door, which wasn't too good. So we've now added a little bit more Vallejo White to the previous mix, and we're just highlighting that. Again, exactly the same method that you used on the top two parts, in terms of highlighting and leaving some of the recesses really dark and that kind of thing. Some of the flat surfaces as well dark, as though it's looking in through a body of liquid. Putting little thin streaks of reflection and light in that. We've added a little bit more white to the previous mix. We're just going to do one final bit of highlights before we move on to pure white. And there's not a whole lot that you're highlighting on this, it is a very small amount. Very thin highlights on different areas. Next up, we're going to use just pure Vallejo White. We're just going to use this to do the final highlights on this section. Like so. Okay, so now we're going to be doing the pupils on his eyes. Now this took me a little bit longer than expected, but I've left all the mess ups and things like that in place, because doing his eyes when they're both the same kind of shape is fine. However, the eye on the left there, the eyelids and all that kind of stuff has been removed from it, so the actual eye itself is a lot bigger than the one on the right, and you can see around the side of it. So when I was trying to add the pupil was in the wrong place, so then I had to repaint it white, then used black, put a bit too much black on, had to go around it and pick out the actual pupil once again with a little bit of white on the brush, slowly working it around the pupil to make sure that you have the white of the eye all the way around. So quite happy with how it turned out eventually. It just took me a little bit of time to get there. So now we're going to be using a little bit of Vallejo Black, and this is just going to be to do the writing on the parchment sections of Purity Seal. Like so. Now we're going to be adding a little bit of Citadel Carroburg Crimson. I'm going to be using this to do a few little details on his face, like where the wounds have opened up. So you have by his mouth there and his cheek, the top of his head. So we're doing little streaks so the blood is running from those wounds up the bone or up the skin towards where that weird column of fluid is coming off him. If you want to, you can do some of these little streaks running down the bones too, and towards and actually into that fluidy bit. So now I'm going to use some Citadel Xereus purple. I'm just going to re-highlight this swirly bit in his hand. That's the technical term for that. There's not too many ridges and creases in this, so if you want to paint them on by highlighting specific bits and leaving some of the Druchii Violet and streaks between it, that's fine too. Now we are going to use a little bit of Citadel Genestealer purple and add the first highlight to this swirly bit. Basically, you're going to be working this in the same way that you worked on the column of liquid. Maybe a little bit more in terms of like a vortex or something like that, so it's all swirling round and round, so you want to try and keep those lines going around it and following the same route. So as we go along, we're going to be making little lighter parts, and those lighter parts are going to be streaking in the way that that swirly bit is turning, if that makes sense. I'm going to use a little bit of pink horror as the next colour, and just highlight those Genestealer purple parts again. Like so. Going to do another highlight now with Citadel Emperor's Children. I'm just going to highlight those parts that we put the pink horror on. You'll see as you're looking and painting this part, there's like little lumps, as though if you imagine that to be fluid, there's like a lump in the middle of it and the fluid's kind of going over it or around it, or it's within the fluid. So what I'm going to be doing is making these bits a little bit lighter than the rest, and doing them so there's like a streak of light coming from them, as though it's some sort of, I don't know, energy within it maybe, and the light is kind of trailing behind it within that little purple vortex. So we're going to add a little bit of white to the pink horror. I'm just going to do a little bit more highlighting on those areas. So I'm starting to do the little swirls. You see me rotating it a lot. I'm trying to work out which way it's going on a specific part because there's that many little different bits. Slightly out of focus there, annoyingly. Now we're just going to be using some pure Vallejo White to do the final highlights on the purple swirly bit. We're doing this just highlighting those little specific points where we've been highlighting as we've gone through. Like so. Okay, next up we're going to use some Citadel Mook green. We're going to be painting this little tube of energy which is going into one of his shoulder mounted things, and it goes down into the swirly bit. I'll try and keep that in view for the rest of them. What I want to do here is paint it up so that it looks like it's getting lighter towards where it joins the swirl. So we're going to add a little bit of Vallejo White to that to the Mook green, and then add that to that section of the tube. I'm also going to be using the green just to add a little bit of a green section to the swirly thing, as that's spinning around, the energy from that is kind of blending in with it a little bit too. Apologies, the camera angle isn't the best here. It's quite an awkward part. It probably would have been better painting sub-assembly maybe. So adding a little bit more white here. We're just going to do some little highlights on that at the bottom to make it look like that's where the lightest point of that energy beam is, and then add some of that to the swirl as well, where the green is kind of joining in with the purple. Now adding a pure bit of white just to top that off and add a few little spots of pure white onto it. Now we're working on the blades of his weapon. I'm going to start by reapplying some Citadel Mook green. What we're going to do here is apply it to specific parts of the tubes and the blade. I'm going to try and work on almost opposites on the blade, so we'll be painting one part of it with the Mook green and we'll be leaving another part of it with the shade there. You'll see why as we go along through it. So we're going to paint part of this blade, the front and the end of it, and then paint a little bit in the middle of the top part. I could probably really do with doing that in just two sections, so like the tip of the blade in Mook green and the other part shaded. But three parts will do us for now. Now we've added a little bit of Vallejo White to the Moot green, and we are going to highlight these areas. So this section in the middle, we've highlighted the middle of that. And then the tube, we're doing a similar energy beam to the one we've just done going into the swirl, where it's getting lighter towards the bottom. So if you work at it on opposite, so you're doing the tip of the blade here, and the flat surface that it's attached to, you are doing the other end of it highlighted. So now we're adding a little bit more Vallejo White to the previous mix. We're just highlighting these sections again, leaving some of the previous layers beneath it so that you can see them. Like so. I've added a little bit more Vallejo White to it. There's another one where we're just going to keep adding white to it and white to it until it gets lighter and lighter and lighter, until you can do a final edge highlight of pure white. But you can see that the blade is starting to take shape with those lighter shady parts and the darker parts where the shade is still present. And when we come to the end, we will be adding more shade to that to darken it up. But you can see the blades here, you've got the light sections here, then the other edge of the blade, the light section is at the top, and then vice versa on the top. The very tip of the blade's white, and then the base of the other section, like the interior part of the blade, is white too. You're seeing here why the Illuminor Szeras part is split over two videos, and it's because these sections, although they're not that complicated, there's that many different sections and different colours and bits where you're having to do this similar kind of light and dark effect, that it does take a lot of time to get them all done. Now we're going to be using some pure Vallejo White. This is going to be to do the final highlights to these sections of green, and some of the edges too, just to give them a little bit of a light effect, make them stand out a little bit. And now to finish off those blades, we are going to use a little bit of Citadel Blood green, and where you've got those shaded areas, you're just going to add a little bit more shade into the middle of those to darken them up a bit. Slightly off camera there, but you should see it on these parts here. So by adding that extra little bit of Blood green, it does darken them down so that you can get a nice bit of almost blending on the go by adding that to darken them, so you've got a starker contrast to the lighter parts next to them and at the other end of the same section, like so. Now we're going to be using a little bit of Citadel Ahriman blue. I'm going to start working on the pieces of crystal here. Now thanks for mentioning that it's bits of blackstone or similar on his shoulder there, so I presume these crystally bits are too. We're going to start by doing Ahriman blue here, and we're going to start building up layers much like we did on the blade of his weapon there, so that we have this going from the dark shaded Ahriman blue all the way up to almost white. Now we're going to add a little bit of white to the previous Ahriman blue, and then we are going to start highlighting these sections to bring out the details and the angles and the corners and those ridges too. And you may think it's looking a bit too blue, and it's going to be a bit too blue once it's finished, but we are going to tone this down once we've done the highlights with a green shade. The Blood green is, and that will give it that nice blue green that you see on the pictures. May not be exactly the same, but it's good enough for me. Adding a little bit more white to the previous mix, and we're just going to be highlighting these sections again, making those sections brighter and bringing out the colours on them. You can see there the top of that crystal is looking like it's catching the light quite nicely, which I'm quite pleased about. We're also working this onto the piece of blackstone on his shoulder as well, like so. Now we're going to use some Citadel Bieltan green shade, and that is just going to be washed over the whole thing. Now you don't have to be sparing with this, you can put quite a bit on. It's worth doing it in 2 layers so you don't get big shiny bits where the recesses are. We're going to paint it onto these crystals that are on his staff as well, and that just gives that nice, almost like a sea green kind of colour. And once that's dry, if you want to, you can give that another layer of Bieltan green. So now I'm going to use a little bit of Vallejo German grey. We're going to highlight the pieces of his armour and his body where it's mainly just black Templar at the moment. This is just to catch the edges and the details to make them stand out, because there is quite a bit of detail on them. You've got the sort of like details down his back here where it's got the very Necron lines and circles on the armour plates. You've got the sections on the joints of his legs and also the armour plates on those kind of blades on his lower leg. Now we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Mechanicus Standard Grey, and we are going to be using this to highlight the sections we've just used the German Grey on. While the German Grey did almost not massive highlights on it, we just used the German Grey to do slight highlights on it. We're just using the Mechanicus Standard Grey to do those edges and the corners, just to make those details stand out, so it's not just kind of a shaded dark grey and black mess. That picks out the details and makes those stand out and gives shape to it when you're looking at it from a slight distance. Now I'm going to use a little tiny bit of Vallejo Modeler Chrome. I'm just going to use this to do a few of the details, like the Necron shapes and symbols that he's got on his staff and also on his chest. This is a prime section that could have been done prior to be put together to make it a bit easier, but no worries, we can do it well enough, and it is hidden behind his hand also. Now I'm going to use some Vallejo White. I'm going to use this to paint the sections that we're going to have glowing. So where we put the Apothecary White earlier on, the contrast, we're going to put some more pure white over these areas, leaving the Apothecary White in the recesses and towards the edges. That just means that when we put the Tesseract glow on there, we are going to have a nice bright central point as though it is glowing. I'm also going to be adding a little bit of Tesseract glow to a few areas because I'm playing about with OSL a little bit with these ones when I'm using the glow, just to see how it works and whether there's an easy way of doing it. So you may see me adding that to the edges of hands and other little details as though it's catching the light a little bit. While it doesn't look perfect, it is something that I'm working on developing, so hopefully be able to put up a video on how I'm doing that in the future. Not to forget, there's one of these glowing things on his left wrist, and that is something which I completely failed to paint on this. It's painted white, ready to go, but I think it is actually still white in the drawer. The final thing we're going to do is use a little tiny bit of Citadel Blood for the Blood God, and we're going to use this on the areas where his skin has been flayed away, but he's not quite had it all absorbed yet, so it's going to be quite red and sore and bloody. I was going to do a few bits of this around his face and mouth, where he's got those open wounds and all the stuff is being sucked off his body and sent to the purple swirly thing in Xereus' hands, like so. And that is the finished Illuminor Szeras. That's a really cool model. It's got so many details in it. It did take a while to get there. It's like nearly or just over an hour worth of footage. But it's a cracking model, well worth putting the effort in for it. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Also, think about subscribing to some of our other social media, linked below. Thanks very much.